The Detention That Never Ends Crescent Valley High School had its share of ghost stories, but none were more infamous than the legend of Room 13. Years ago, it was said, a teacher named Mr. Grayson had given detention to a group of students for a prank gone wrong. But that evening, something terrible happened. The students and Mr. Grayson vanished without a trace, and the room was sealed off. The school claimed it was just a freak accidental gas leak. Maybe, but the whispers of the truth never died. Some said the students were trapped in the room forever. Others believed Mr. Grayson's spirit still roamed the halls, punishing anyone who dared enter. The room had remained locked for decades, until now. It started with a simple prank. Mia, Jake, and Lucy had set off the school's fire alarms as a joke during lunch. Principal Andrews was furious. "Detention!" he barked. 3 hours after school, and don't even think about skipping it. The trio groaned but didn't think much of it until they saw the room number on their slips, Room 13. "Isn't that the haunted room?" Lucy whispered as they stood outside the rusted door that afternoon. Jake snorted. "Please. It's just a dumb story. Let's get this over with." Reluctantly, they pushed the door open. The room was eerily untouched. Dust coated the desks, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Faded posters hung crooked on the walls, and the clock above the chalkboard was frozen at 3:13 a.m. "I thought this room was supposed to be locked," Mia said, uneasily eyeing the empty desks. Jake shrugged. "Maybe they finally decided to use it again. It's just a room, guys." They sat down, waiting for their punishment to begin. But no teacher showed up. The first hour passed in silence, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Mia checked her phone. "It's 5 p.m. Shouldn't we be done by now?" Lucy frowned. "What do you mean? It's only 4:15. Mia held up her phone, but Lucy showed a different time. Confused, they turned to Jake, whose watch had stopped completely. The lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed from the back of the room. "Did you hear that?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Jake walked toward the noise. "It's probably just a pipe or something." But as he reached the back of the room, the chalkboard suddenly screeched, as if invisible hands were dragging chalk across it. The trio froze as words began to appear. "You shouldn't be here." Jake backed away. "Okay, that's creepy." Before they could react, the door slammed shut, locking them in. "Let's get out of here," Mia shouted, rushing to the door. She yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Lucy's voice shook. What if the stories are true?" The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights came back on, the room had changed. The desks weren't empty anymore. Instead, faint impressions of faces twisted in fear were etched into the wood. Mia gasped. "Are those—" "They look like students," Lucy whispered, her face pale. Jake tried to stay calm. "It's just a prank. Someone's messing with us." But his confidence wavered as one of the faces slowly turned its head to look at him. Suddenly, a low, guttural voice filled the room. "Detention is forever." Panic set in. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing thick and oppressive. The clock, which had been frozen, began to tick backward. Jake banged on the door. "Let us out!" But the room wasn't letting them go. The desks shifted, forming a circle around the trio. The faces on the desks whispered now, their words overlapping in an unintelligible chorus. Mia screamed as one of the faces reached out, its hand made of splinters and shadows. "It's pulling me!" she cried, struggling to break free. Jake grabbed her arm, but the room seemed determined to keep her. Shadows wrapped around her legs, dragging her toward the chalkboard, which now read, "Stay with US." Just when it seemed like Mia would disappear into the darkness, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. Then, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man in an old-fashioned suit, his face pale and gaunt. His hollow eyes scanned the room, and a cruel smile spread across his lips. "Mr. Grayson?" Lucy whispered, trembling. He looked at the trio, his voice cold and echoing. "Detention is not over. You've broken the rules, and now you'll stay just like the others." The faces on the desks began to laugh, their distorted voices filling the room. Desperate, Jake spotted an old fire extinguisher in the corner. "Distract him!" he yelled, grabbing it and smashing it against the nearest window. To their shock, the glass didn't shatter instead. It rippled like water. But the distraction was enough for Mia and Lucy to knock over a desk, sending it crashing into Mr. Grayson. The room screamed as if in pain, and the trio seized their chance. Together, they charged at the door, which burst open, spilling them into the hallway. When they turned back, room 13 was gone. In its place was a blank wall, as if the room had never existed. They reported the incident to Principal Andrews, but he didn't believe them. The next day, they returned to find no sign of room 13. But the whispers followed them. At night, they heard scratching at their windows. Messages appeared on mirrors. Detention is forever. And one by one, they began to disappear. Room 13 wasn't finished. It never would be. Whispers in the locker room. Every school has its ghost stories. But at Ridgewood High, the tale of the locker room was infamous. They said it started years ago with the mysterious disappearance of a star athlete, Ethan Carter. He had been last seen heading into the locker room late one evening after practice. No one saw him leave, and despite frantic searches, he was never found. The school closed the locker room for months, but when it reopened, strange things began to happen. Students whispered about voices, shadows, and cold spots. Some swore they saw Ethan's jersey hanging by itself in the locker he used #17. The school denied the rumors, chalking it up to teenage imaginations, but those who stayed late knew better. Mark, a senior on the basketball team, stayed late one Friday night to work on his free throws. The gym echoed with the sound of bouncing balls, the squeak of his sneakers, and the occasional clang of the rim. "Last shot," he muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow. He made it and felt a sense of accomplishment. He headed to the locker room, dreading the cold shower, but eager to go home. The moment he opened the door, a strange chill greeted him. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the faint scent of mildew mixed with something metallic lingered in the air. Mark shrugged it off. "Old building," he said, trying to convince himself. As he changed out of his sweaty gear, he thought he heard something soft, almost imperceptible. "Mark?" He froze, his heart racing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Silence. He shook his head. "You're just hearing things," he muttered, slamming his locker shut. The sound echoed louder than he expected, sending a shiver down his spine. As he walked to the showers, he heard it again. "Mark, over here." It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from deeper in the locker room. Mark decided to investigate. "All right, who's messing with me?" he said, his voice wavering. As he turned a corner, he saw something hanging in the distance. It was a Jersey Hash 17. He frowned. That can't be right. They retired Ethan's number years ago. The jersey swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped closer. The name Carter was stitched on the back, just as he remembered seeing in the school's trophy case. The whispers grew louder. "Help me." Mark spun around, his breath quickening. The locker room was empty, but the sound seemed to echo all around him. Deciding he'd had enough, Mark grabbed his bag and headed for the exit. But as he reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. "Come on," he growled, pulling harder. Behind him, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into semi-darkness. Shadows danced along the walls, growing and twisting unnaturally. One of them seemed to step away from the wall, taking shape. Mark turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure stood there, faint but unmistakable, a boy in a basketball uniform. "Ethan?" Mark whispered. The figure tilted its head. Its voice was soft but strained. "You have to leave." Mark's mouth went dry. "I'm trying. The door's stuck." The figure's eyes darkened. "They won't let you." The shadows grew thicker, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices. They were angry, desperate, pleading. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over a bench. As he fell, he noticed something strike Ethan's old locker, which had been permanently sealed after his disappearance, was open. Inside was a mirror, cracked and dirty. But as Mark looked into it, he didn't see his reflection. Instead, he saw Ethan pale, gaunt, and terrified. "Help me!" Ethan's voice echoed, louder now. "They're keeping me here." Mark crawled toward the locker, drawn to the mirror. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan's eyes darted behind Mark. "Don't let them touch you." Mark turned and saw the shadows closing in, their forms shifting into skeletal hands reaching for him. He scrambled to his feet, the whispers now a deafening roar. "Open the door!" he shouted, pounding on it. The figure of Ethan appeared again, now standing between Mark and the shadows. "You have to break it." "Break what?" Mark screamed. "The mirror." Ethan's voice was desperate. Mark grabbed a nearby weight plate from the bench press. The shadows clawed at him, cold and suffocating, but he swung the plate with all his strength. The mirror shattered, and the room erupted in a blinding light. When Mark opened his eyes, he was lying on the locker room floor. The lights were steady, and the whispers were gone. He stood shakily, looking around. The jersey was gone, and Ethan's locker was sealed shut once more. The door opened easily now, and Mark stumbled out into the hallway. The next day, the school announced that the locker room would be closed for renovations. Mark didn't tell anyone what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As he passed the trophy case, he noticed Ethan's jersey had returned to its spot. But something was different. The photo next to Ethan's team picture now had one extra face in the background. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but Mark could see it clearly. It was him. That night, as Mark tried to sleep, he heard it again. "Help me?" And he knew the locker room wasn't finished with him yet. The last bell's curse for as long as anyone could remember. Elmwood High School's bell tower had been a source of eerie fascination. Perched atop the old brick school building, its chime was supposed to mark the start and end of classes, but the bell had been silent for decades. Legend had it that, years ago, a student named Evelyn Gray had fallen to her death from the tower. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered it was no accident at all. After the incident, the school sealed the bell tower and stopped using it entirely. But the students knew the truth. Every year, on the anniversary of Evelyn's death, the bell would ring just once after school. And whoever heard it would disappear before the next morning. They called it the last bell's curse. It was the week of Halloween, and the air was thick with anticipation. As the final bell rang, students filed out of their classrooms, eager to head home. But in the corner of the cafeteria, a group of seniors was busy hatching a dangerous plan. "Let's settle it once and for all," Jake said, leaning forward with a wicked grin. "We'll prove the curse isn't real." "Are you serious?" Claire asked, nervously glancing around. "You know what happened to that kid last year. That's just a stupid rumor," Jake scoffed. "He probably ran away or something. Look, we'll go up to the bell tower tonight, wait for it to ring, and nothing will happen. Easy." Reluctantly, Claire, Ethan, and Sarah agreed. But as they left the cafeteria, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake. That night, the four of them snuck back into the school, armed with flashlights and a pair of bolt cutters. The halls were eerily silent, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Jake smirked. "Scared already?" They reached the old door to the bell tower, its surface scratched and weathered with age. A rusty chain hung across it, but Jake made quick work of it with the cutters. As the door creaked open, a rush of cold air greeted them. The narrow staircase spiraled upward into darkness, and the faint scent of dust and decay lingered in the air. "Let's go," Jake said, leading the way. The climb was steep and treacherous, the stairs groaning under their weight. Claire clung to the railing, her heart pounding with every step. Halfway up, they noticed something strange. Faint, smeared handprints on the walls, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. "Probably just paint," Jake muttered, though his bravado was starting to waver. When they finally reached the top, they found themselves in a cramped, dusty room. The massive bell loomed in the center, its surface tarnished and cracked. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the air was heavy with an oppressive silence. "See? Nothing scary," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Ethan pointed at the bell. "Do you think it still works?" Jake grinned. "Let's find out." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the rope hanging from the bell and gave it a tug. The sound that followed was deafening, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to shake the entire tower. "Are you crazy?" Claire shouted, covering her ears. But then, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "That's enough," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Let's go." Jake rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. They turned to leave, but the staircase was gone. "What the hell?" Ethan said, staring at the empty space where the stairs had been. The room began to change. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the cobwebs twisting into grotesque shapes. The temperature dropped, and the faint sound of laughter echoed around them. Claire's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner. It was a girl, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes hollow and staring. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. Before anyone could answer, the bell began to swing on its own, ringing out a haunting chime. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The figure stepped into the light, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her voice was a low, guttural whisper. "Why are you here?" Jake stumbled backward. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just curious." The figure tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Curiosity killed me too. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of screams, dozens of voices crying out in pain and terror. The walls were covered in scratch marks, and the floor began to crumble beneath their feet. "Run!" Ethan shouted, though there was nowhere to go. Evelyn's voice echoed around them. No one escapes the curse. As the floor gave way, Claire grabbed the bell rope to steady herself. Jake and Sarah clung to the wall, while Ethan tried to reach for her. "Help me!" Claire screamed as the shadows began to wrap around her legs, pulling her toward the center of the room. Evelyn's figure loomed above her, her hollow eyes filled with rage. "One must stay," she said. Jake's face twisted with fear. "We have to leave her. It's the only way." "No!" Ethan shouted, but before he could act, Jake pushed Claire toward the shadows and ran toward the bell rope. "I'm sorry!" Jake screamed as he yanked the rope again, causing the bell to ring once more. The shadows surged forward, enveloping Claire as her screams were swallowed by the darkness. The next thing they knew, Jake, Ethan, and Sarah were back at the bottom of the tower. The door to the bell room was sealed once again, and Claire was nowhere to be found. What just happened? Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." As they stumbled out of the school, the clock struck midnight. In the distance, the bell rang one final time. The next morning, the school was buzzing with news of Claire's disappearance. The police found no trace of her, and the students whispered that the curse had claimed another victim. Jake, Ethan, and Sarah never spoke of what happened that night. But every time they passed the bell tower, they felt its silent warning. And every year, on the anniversary of Evelyn's death, the bell still rang once. Who would be next?